All right, everybody. Thanks for being here. And I'm going to start with a note that today is Spirit Day, a day dedicated to ending bullying against LGBTQI youth, plus youth. So wearing purple for Spirit Day, which is traditional. So let's all keep folks who have experienced that kind of bullying and discrimination in mind. And today we were going to talk a bit about denial of Eucharist. And I've shifted the topic a little bit from what we originally had put out as weaponization of Eucharist. So I just want to kind of acknowledge that, and you'll see why in a little bit. Okay, are folks now seeing the screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Great. Okay. So just kind of to talk, okay, why are we not going to the next screen here? Okay, so I just want to kind of set a little bit of context for the discussion and then give some of the history of communion denials and then talk about sort of the current response and my own thoughts on some suggested responses to this issue. Right, so that's just a little bit of how this is going to walk through. And at the beginning, what I'd like to do is to just ask each of you to hold in your mind a memory of a profoundly Eucharistic experience that you have had at some point in your life. And I'm going to share one of mine. And I think most of us on this session have attended at least one of the large annual gatherings that Call to Action used to present each year in Milwaukee. They were, for many folks, a once-a-year touchstone for progressive Catholics, especially during the papacies of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, when so much that was coming from the institutional church was oppressive and really prioritized adherence to dogma above everything else. And as you'll recall, the conference always ended with a Eucharistic liturgy that was co-presided by all sorts of people, a liturgy that was generally a joyous commissioning before we all dispersed to serve, to fight, to witness, or all of the above for another year. So there was one year back in the late 1990s when I had to book a flight back to Boston at a time that meant I was going to have to leave before the conference liturgy concluded. So not wanting to be disruptive when I departed, I sat on the carpet at the back of the ballroom near a door with my suitcase leaning against the wall next to me. And a family with a 3-year-old positioned themselves nearby, probably so that they could make a quick exit if the little tyke, whose name was Claire, got fidgety or noisy. And those of you who know me, I love little kids, and I couldn't resist engaging Claire in some quiet games as the liturgy progressed. And at some point during the homily, Claire scampered over to her parents, and one of the grown-ups pulled a bologna sandwich from the little cooler they had. And Claire came back to where I was, sat on my leg, and tore off a piece of the sandwich and offered it to me. And as we sat there sharing bologna on white bread, I experienced one of the most profound moments of Eucharist in my life. I often think about how communion with Claire exemplifies so much of what I think the sacrament represents: generosity, connection, simplicity, transcendence in the midst of the mundane, and joy. Communion with Claire had no ritual purity, no measurement of how many drops of water went into the cup of wine. In fact, we had her sippy cup and my little plastic conference cup of water. No ordained presider, no sacred test, but it was Eucharist nonetheless. Mm-hmm. I imagine we've all had this kind of experience, and I wonder if one or two of you would be able to share very briefly your own Eucharistic encounter.
This is I can. This was probably back in the 70s or 80s, and I was part of a Curcio team. I think most of you know what Curcio is. And we had a priest on the team, but he couldn't make it that night. And this was at somebody's house. And she set up this beautiful agape with bread and wine and candles and a table set like a cross. And we did the ritual, and it was like a light went on inside of me. Not only was I so terribly moved by it, but it was Eucharist. And that was the first time I ever experienced Eucharist outside of your traditional Mass.
Oh, it sounds so powerful.
It was changed my life.
Yeah. Yeah.
For the better.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Carolyn. Anyone else? No.
I feel like I've had so many of these experiences that it's hard to pick out one. I would say most all of the women church liturgies are profound Eucharist. I am happy when I feel like those gathered are presiding, that it is not one person's job to preside.
Right. Oh my gosh, Ruth, if I had tried to get to the end of my talk, I couldn't have asked for a better plant in the audience. Or my thinking, because I think that you've hit on, the community side of this and who owns it. And that's where I think we're going to eventually go. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
So, so stay in that reverence of the time. We all know that denial of communion is nothing new. I imagine every one of us is aware of people, mostly women, but some men whose first marriages failed and who never got annulments for whatever reason, who sat at Mass week after week after week, never presenting themselves for communion because church rules banned them for receiving. Sarah, welcome. So good to have you here.
Oh, hi, Sarah.
Welcome.
I'm going to go on and we'll chat in a bit. We have also experienced denials of Eucharist in other situations. People who participate in the ordinations of women, especially it seems the nuns, LGBTQ plus people, particularly those who are engaged in public witnesses, like wearing a rainbow button or rainbow sash, who are married or who are presenting themselves in church in what is deemed gender inappropriate ways, have had communion withheld from them. I recall being at a funeral mass for the mother of a dear friend of mine at a parish north of Boston that had been the home to 3 generations of her family. And in fact, her grandparents and her parents literally helped build the building. And just before proceeding to the altar rail during the funeral, the priest announced that he expected that anyone who was not baptized Catholic, who was remarried without an annulment, or who was in a same-sex relationship would be expected to abstain from communion. And this, of course, included my friend who was in a lesbian relationship at the time. And over half of the people who were attending the Mass were members of Dignity community, many partnered. So there was just this stunned anger in the church. And as the priest and the servers approached the head of the aisle, everybody just stood up and we escorted our friend and her partner to communion, and we all just received. And when the Mass concluded, my friend and her sister went up to the priest and politely asked him not to bother going to the internment, that we would handle it ourselves from there. And they told him that his exclusionary statement was pastorally damaging at a time that they and their community needed the comfort of their church. And I was just so struck by how they wound up standing for themselves and their community in the depth of their grief at a time of when sacraments were withheld. And of course, we're brought to this conversation today because of the looming threat that the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops will soon issue a letter on the Eucharist that bans Catholic politicians who support legal access to abortion from receiving communion. Sometimes support for other reproductive health services or same-sex marriage are also mentioned as reasons for exclusions, but abortion is really the current hot button. Again, this is not new. And I'm going to go back to screen sharing for a little bit because some of this gets wordy. So let me put that up. Oh. Okay. Okay. Oop. Okay. So the basis for these denials come from Canon 915 from the 1983 Code of Canon Law, and I thought it would be helpful for us to all see the text. That those who have been excommunicated or interdicted after the imposition or declaration of the penalty, and others obstinately persevering in manifest grave sin are not to be admitted to Holy Communion. So we see that support for abortion is considered obstinately persevering in manifest grave sin. Big words.
Is birth control the same?
It's not mentioned specifically in the documents, but they're, it's the slippery slope kind of thing, right? The other document that I found really contributing to this conversation that I think is less known is from a 2004 piece that came out of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith at the time that it was headed by Cardinal Ratzinger, of course, later Benedict XVI, that was called Worthiness to Receive Holy Communion, General Principles. They all had these awfully long names. And this document is just riddled with male language. So I felt compelled to call every one of them out. So, but as we read through it, if a Catholic politician's formal cooperation in the grave sin of abortion or euthanasia becomes manifest by consistently campaigning and voting for permissive abortion or euthanasia laws, the politician's pastor is obliged to instruct the politician about the church teachings and inform him that he should not present himself for Holy Communion as long as the objective situation of sin, blah, 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 blah. So anyhow, the pastor's supposed to talk to the politician, warn that person that they are risking being banned from community. As in the case of Catholics who divorce and remarry, if these precautionary measures fail to obtain the desired effect or are impossible, and the person in question with obstinate persistence still presents himself to receive Holy Eucharist, the minister of Holy Communion must refuse to distribute it. So those are a couple of sort of Vatican level orders that are part of this trends. There are also, local dioceses have also passed things. For example, back in 2005, the Archdiocese of Washington issued a statement prohibiting communion to anyone attempting to make a political statement with the Eucharist. Interestingly, it has now been removed from their website. I don't know if that's due to the new-ish Archbishop there. But interesting that it's taken down. But that statement has reportedly been used against people for the Rainbow Sash movement, for example, and then also against people who are wearing buttons indicating pro-choice positions, support for marriage equality, or even certain political candidates. There have been a number of politicians who have been subjected to this communion ban or threats. The first one that I remember was back in 1989. I don't know if folks remember Lucy Calea, a pro-choice candidate in California, who the Bishop of San Diego at that time denied her communion, but then a bishop in Northern California gave her California. It was Bishop Quinn, and that became a huge media thing. There's been New York Governor Mario Cuomo, who was threatened, John Kerry, Rudy Giuliani, of all people, Kansas Governor Kathleen Sebelius, and of course, President Biden, among others. There is also something that has been seen as a general agreement by the USCCB in 2005. The decision about how to handle these cases should be left to the individual diocese. You see that popping up in some of the media coverage about the current debate. So despite this agreement, despite warnings and pleas from the Vatican and words of caution from within their own ranks, back in the spring, USCCB commissioned a small committee to draft a document on the reception of communion that will be considered at their annual meeting scheduled for next month. As of yet, no drafts or information on the content of the drafts have been made public, at least that I know of. The votes taken in the spring seem to indicate that the conference has sufficient support to reach the 2/3 threshold necessary for internal approval of such a document. However, they would also require Vatican approval for enforcement, and that seems highly unlikely to be granted. So where are we, and what does this mean for us? I look at it in two ways. First, this effort that USCCB is engaged in clearly violates most Catholics' understanding of the Eucharist and beliefs about how it should be administered. Many of you are probably familiar with a poll that 2/3 of Catholics do not think that communion should be withheld from pro-choice politicians. This effort's been called coercive, mean-spirited, pastorally harmful, divisive, the weaponization of communion, and the list goes on and on. So having folks willing and able to speak compellingly about what this could mean for Catholics, for public servants, and in the public sphere is really important. I think it's really essential that those of us who believe that communion should not be used this way, that if we can help Catholics give voice to their feelings and see themselves represented in public witness, statements, letters in the news media, is really important. And that's really the thinking behind the Bread Not Stones effort. It's being coordinated by our colleagues in CORE, some of us whom also participate in this circle. By using personal testimony, ritual, public witness, media statements, and events, this position will be expressed, including at a witness planned for the opening day of the USCCB fall meeting. It is hoped that these efforts will help folks understand both the reverence Catholics have for the sacrament of the Eucharist and the desire for a more inclusive and respectful expression of church. But I really think there is a larger issue here. And on a more substantial issue, I think that the institutionalization of Eucharist is an even more profound denial. It has more significant consequences, and it's a really complex issue that few have grappled with. We all know that from the Seder Jesus celebrated with his friends in Jerusalem just before his death, through the early centuries of the Christian movement, the sharing of the body and blood of Christ was essentially a house church function. It took myriad forms, was probably most often embedded in a community meal, and really was a way of fortifying a minority community in their identity and mission. Over time, the Eucharist became more and more removed from the community and became something highly ritualized and administered only by the clerical caste. It became shrouded in mystery and taboo, with rules about what kind of bread could be used, dramatic costume and movements, became limited to space not accessible to the general public, and locked in special golden boxes. All of this has contributed to the distance that most Catholics and others have from Eucharist, seeing it truly as something we receive rather than something we are vitally and essentially part of creating, sharing, and responding to, something we are, the body of Christ. I think by extension, the institutionalization of Eucharist contributes to and strengthens the dualism with which we approach the world, seeing everything in it as either sacred or profane. It removes the sense of sacramentality and holiness from our everyday lives, segregating what is holy to places under clerical control. It denies us the capacity to name and claim those abundant moments of grace with the power that they deserve. And I think this is why the work of women church convergence groups is so important. It is in our house churches, in our solidarity work, in creative liturgy, in use of materials that are different from those used in institutional structures, in sharing song and dance and laughter and poetry and art and nature in our rituals, in lifting up the work of women and marginalized people, that we reclaim the essence of communion. We tap into its power to nurture and to connect, to inspire and send forth. We once again blend the transcendent and the mundane, embracing what is sacramental in both, prohibiting the many in the church from understanding and experiencing this is, I believe, the more sinful denial of communion and the more persistent denial of communion, and one that too many cannot even recognize as missing in their lives and their faith. For me, communion with Claire was more sacred than any plasticized host placed on my tongue or in my hands in a Saint someone or other or Our Lady of whatever building anywhere in the world. I hold on to the spontaneous generosity and care of a 3-year-old as an authentic and powerful experience of connection and a sacrament. So let's talk.
Well, I thought of something that you might, when you think about people that are denied communion, we had a guy in our diocese somewhere that wouldn't put communion in a hand if your hand was dirty. In other words, if you were a laborer, and many men that do, and women as well, that do manual labor, their hands are not the cleanest or they're a little stained or whatever, he would not give them communion. It was a big deal, in the newspaper or whatever. And the other thing I think that nobody mentions is that my understanding is these priests that leave priesthood and don't get laicized are not welcome to Eucharist either. Is that correct?
That I'm not an expert on. I really
Okay.
don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. Maybe others do.
Well, I just have to tell you, I really appreciate your words because I think it is the gravest sin of the Roman Catholic Church to deny communion to anyone. Anyone who presents themselves for communion should never be refused. What would Jesus do? People wear that on their shirts. Well, exactly what would Jesus do?
He would give them communion.
He would
He
give
would
them.
want everyone to get together and rejoice together and celebrate together and share. That's what he did all the time. He shared with everyone, no matter who they were.
That's right. He did with the loaves and the fishes. He didn't say you get some and you don't. He gave it to everybody, and there was enough for everybody.
Right.
And each took it. And I don't care what it means to you personally. I really don't. I grew up in the era of being afraid of communism. And I remember at that time, you couldn't receive in your hand. You only could receive on your tongue. And I remember being told that that's because of the communist, that if a communist got a hold of Jesus in their hand, they could go outside and stomp on it. I heard that.
Wow.
I heard that from a priest probably 65 years ago. But I mean, is that ridiculous?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, it helped form my personal theology that if Jesus has enough power to come, Jesus has enough power to go. So I'm not worried about it.
Wow. Yeah, we get into some really crazy machinations about this stuff. It's just
Yeah.
The church seems to think that they own Jesus. And that is, only true if the church is defined as the people of God. Even that, I don't even know if anybody owns it. But the fact that they can say who is worthy or not worthy is, who are they to do that? I don't care who they are, all to the Pope. Anyway, I think there is grave sin on the part of the church.
What's the saying? Let him without sin be the first to cast the stone.
Right.
And yet they feel no compulsion. They have no reluctance to judge anyone they want to judge because they don't look like me. They don't wear the same clothes. It's judgment all around. It's not sharing of life-giving things.
I don't believe that every parish is that bad. I think most of them are, but I don't think everyone is. I know Eucharistic ministers who've been told that you don't deny communion to anyone.
It's almost 12:35.
Yep.
Yeah.
Great.
Well, the priests today are being trained by those who have been trained by the dyed-in-the-wool hardliners. And it's going to be a long time before they get rid of that influence. And
I have
even
one more story and I'm going to have to leave in 5 minutes, but
All right, go ahead.
I took my grandson and a friend of mine to Cincinnati Reds baseball game. And we're sitting in our seats and these guys in black suits with collars on are going by us. They had seats farther up than us. Finally, and they were young. Finally, we stopped and said, what are you guys up to or whatever? They're seminarians. They all, the seminary in Cincinnati they're not all Cincinnati. They're from other dioceses that bring them here. And I said, what is this wearing a black suit and a collar? And this one guy comes back, several of them don't have it on. And he said, oh, I would if I could, but I'm only, a sophomore or whatever. I'm not whatever you have to, deacon or whatever. Anyway, I went to the ball game and he said, oh, somebody might need us. It was the most ridiculous thing I ever heard. They might need you. Well, somebody collapses, you just go right on down,
Yeah.
Right. Obviously, there's a special power in that collar that
Evidently.
allows that. So, right.
At a ball
Well,
game, though. It's like,
It's crazy. Yeah, that's why they wear them on planes too. It's not to get access to the first class seats. Right.
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 In case
Right.
somebody collapses, they could bless
Yeah.
them. Oh, anoint them or something.
All right. All right.
When we were doing, when Critical Mass was doing our public Eucharists in a park where a lot of homeless people and drug addicts lived when we weren't there once a month, we didn't stop anybody from coming to our Eucharist. We had no idea who these people were. They were reverent. They were reverent. And of course they got the bread and the wine. Of course they did. And of course the last how many years we haven't been doing it in public, but we recall that every time we meet, that Jesus welcomed everyone to the table.
And so much more than bread and wine, right? They got company and were in community and had people who were respectful and compassionate. Exactly. That's the point. It's not bread and wine is simple. Great.
Wow.
I just want to say thank you, Marianne. I think this is a really terrific presentation of a tough issue. And I hope you're writing it up as an article, because I think that it's the sort of thing that people need to read as a bigger context than just, does Joe Biden get communion or not? And I think that your second point about the institutionalization is critically important and is the ground on which we make the first claim, that that who are these people to say that a person of such manifest faith as Joe Biden, no matter what you think of his politics, would be excluded from the Eucharist? I mean, it makes me wild. It makes me absolutely wild to think about this, because it's such a terrible, it's such a quintessential contradiction of the Christian message. It's like, but then I think about this in terms of the synod and the synod on synodality, or what I call sin oddly. They're gonna sin oddly. I'm writing a little piece called Sin and Sin Oddly, because I think that it's all wrapped up together, that the power questions as you laid them out, and the extent to which these institutional figures think that it's their right and write the laws to make it their right to decide who gets communion, who makes decisions. I mean, the whole thing is so off that I really don't know what to suggest in terms of whether people should participate in any way in the sin oddly approach. And I'm taking a Mary Daly-esque view of this, of course, with my pun, but I think that it's so, because if you participate, it's damned if you do and damned if you don't.
Yeah.
If you take the bait on this in terms of Biden, because let's remember, we're going to have three things going on. We're going to have the meeting in Baltimore, we're going to have the meeting in Rome of Biden and the Pope, and then we're going to have this synodly thing happening. And I think it's all very distracting, and that the function of it is to distract from the real issues in terms of the corruption, the criminality, and, as you say, the institutionalization of something which is so contrary to any reasonable reading of the gospel that it's hard to even respond to it. So I don't know what the best strategy is, whether to take the bait and, like New Ways Ministry is doing something soon about, for LGBT people around the synod. I'm signed up for it. I'll certainly want to see what people have to say, but I just don't know. I just watched Mary McAleese's Root and Branch talk, and she says, "Oh, get your reports in. They're canonically required to read them, and so forth." I don't know if I would give that as good advice. So anyway, those are just some of my questions, but with deep, heartfelt thanks to you and for helping us here. I think you've done a marvelous thing for us.
Thank you.
Yes.
I
Thank
have to
you.
leave.
Yeah.
I love
Yes.
this.
Bye, Ruth.
Bye, Ruth.
Bye.
Yeah. And I know we have to get into the business part of the meeting, but just to respond, I do think that this is the question that we're always grappling with. How do we best confront, the power that the institutional church and so many institutions have absorbed into themselves in a way that does such corrosive damage to human lives, every minute of every day in every part of the world. It's such a big question. We have to acknowledge the realities that these institutions do have impact, do have power, do have control of a lot of things while resisting at the same time. And, the synod may be another really important question for us to grapple with in the months ahead. So for folks who are doing upcoming presentations or who haven't signed up for one yet, framing a conversation about that could be a really useful service for this group. So, but thank you for the attention to think this through and the opportunity to really structure some of my thinking around it. So I appreciate that. Great.
That's a great viewpoint, the institutionalization. And it struck me as you spoke, I didn't realize, and you made it so clear, how things were locked away because they were institutionalized. They were locked away in boxes and in hidden parts of the church where ordinary people don't go. Ordinarily, it's not free. It is, but it's not. And it just made it so clear to me how institutionalization has affected the rites and the sacraments all off to one side, and everybody else is milling around, hoping for the best, hoping for some grace. But that's an interesting view to take when we present all our other topics. I know CEPOWAC could use that approach when they do their presentation in January.